Alrighty, welcome in everyone to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Wednesday, January 15th around here, and we have a great show for you today. Going to take a little bit of a hiatus from all the national title talk, and tomorrow we'll be in an entire national title talk. We will do it in my picks, we'll do matchups, we'll do storyline, we'll do everything around the national title tomorrow, but I do want to get into a little talk around some different things going on around college football, and I'll start with the first year of the CFP. I'll give a little bit of a report card how both the expansionist and anti-expansionist side have very good arguments coming out of this year for why it should go different directions. I'll give my full pick on that and give my full grade on the first year of the CFP. Then we'll get into the Big Ten and the SEC and just how long will the Big Ten's reign last over the college football world, and why are some of the things happening in the sport like NIL kind of leaning towards that direction a little bit more so than the SEC. And then we'll get to a little bit of a head coaching wrap up, and I put a question mark next to the wrap up because I'm not necessarily sure it's fully wrapped up, but we'll look at the biggest head coaching hires in the Power 4 and the Group of 5 in coordinator hires that are absolutely huge, and then just some final names to watch, a couple of guys that are still out there that could be looking for jobs, but I'd be a little bit surprised. Then we'll get back to the national title just a little bit. We'll talk about how each team got here, take a look back at the seasons for Ohio State and Notre Dame, look at the storylines, look at a lot of different things that happened for them throughout this year, and then we got some questions for the national title coming up. Definitely some big time ones, including can Notre Dame handle Jeremiah Smith? Going to be probably the biggest question as you head into this one, but definitely something to watch. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question to the front of the line on the screen so we can have a fun back and forth here is to use that super chat. At the bottom of the chat on the Sports Network page, you can click that $, add any question, comment you like. It'll pop up on the screen and we can have a fun back and forth here. Definitely want this to be as interactive as possible, so utilize that and we can have a fun back and forth. But let's go ahead and jump into this thing because the 12-team playoff is coming to an end. You know, we have the national title on Monday, and hopefully this does help this a little bit. You know, maybe it'll bump it up a couple of different grades, but at the end of the day, I feel like it's a good time to take a step back and look at the first year of the 12-team playoff. Look at what it gave us, what it took away from us, some different pros and cons, and some different expansionist and anti-expansionist arguments. And frankly, I think when you look back at this thing, I think there's arguments on both sides. I think you very well could make the argument that it was not a great thing for different parts of the sport. You could easily argue it was fantastic for different parts of the sport, and I'm a little bit confused as well. I'm kind of in between these two, so I'll give you my grade at the end of this, but I did want to get into the expansionist arguments. You know, what they're pulling from this one to say this was a great move. This was something that absolutely had to happen, and these are reasons why it had to happen. So the biggest one that people have been throwing around is Ohio State and Notre Dame wouldn't have been in the 14 playoff. We saw a couple of different rankings at the very end. It was Notre Dame 5, it was Ohio State 6, so they would have been those two teams right on the outside looking in. Now, I have said in the past that I do think Notre Dame might have slid in, and maybe even Ohio State might have slid in over Penn State and Texas after those games, but at the end of the day, we don't know that. What we do know is they were ranked 5 and 6 in the last rankings, so they wouldn't have been in the 14 playoff. And now, and they've made a run to a title. So that's kind of the big time question. You know, a lot of people, this is what they wanted from the 12-team playoff, was teams that hypothetically can stumble from time to time throughout the year, even at the end of the year, like Ohio State did with Michigan, and then find their footing and really become the team that they're more than capable of being, make it to the national title and enjoy that spotlight. So it is kind of a battle back and forth. I do tend to believe that the selection process would have gone a little bit differently if it was the 4-team playoff. I'm not saying I don't know if Ohio State would have got in. I feel fairly confident that Notre Dame would have found their way in there, but at the end of the day, regardless, it is a show of what this 12 team can give us. You know, teams that might have not had the best year, might have stumbled at different points, might have been a little bit all over the place, definitely have found their way back to the top, and you can make the argument that will give us not a, true champion of the sport, because they will have losses on the schedule. They won't have been dominant from tip to tail, but that's college football. I don't think that's necessarily something that really will keep me up at night, and I don't think it should keep much of anyone up at night at the end of the day. So both these teams would have missed out on the 14 playoff. They find their way to the national title, and every expansionist would tell you that is exactly what they wanted from this thing. So they might have not wanted Notre Dame and Ohio State to be those two teams, but they absolutely did want a team that stumbled in the year and found their footing to be able to make it to a run to a national title, and that's exactly what we got this year. Another one is more meeting on different games. And this is a kind of an interesting argument that really could be argued with anti-expansionists as well, could make this argument just as easily, because I do think there was more emphasis put on certain games, like SMU playing down the stretch. That SMU Pitt game was massive. It was two teams that were very much still in the conversation for the CFP, that were battling for a spot in that ACC title, and it was a huge, huge game over there in Dallas. Obviously, SMU kind of rolled them, but at the end of the day, it carried on throughout the sport. Boise State, we were watching essentially every week, not only to see what Ashton Genty would do, but to see if they could make the CFP. Arizona State, the exact same way, and Iowa State, Kansas State, all of these teams that, reality, when you get to the 9th, 10th week of the season in past years, you're probably not tuning in too much. Now, I'm tuning in because I'm a crazy person, and I absolutely love just every inch of this sport. So the reality is it's somewhat a difference of style between fans, but I do think it did give a little bit more shine to some teams that deserve a little bit more shine. This college football world has been so around the Big Two in the SEC and the Big Ten. It still very much is, and we'll talk about that in the next segment. But overall, you look at this season, I think a lot more people know a lot more about the ACC and the Big 12 than they did in the past years, because the 12-team playoff gave them a reason to tune into these teams. So the month of November was as spread as I've ever seen it before, and I think it was a great thing for the sport. Now, you could easily argue that it took away value from other games, and that's something we'll talk about here in a second, but I will say, being able to see SMU be appointment television, being able to see Boise State and Arizona State be appointment television is a really, really cool thing, and is very, very good for the sport, especially as the top two just kind of gain all this power and kind of take over the sport in a lot of ways. And then the incredible semifinal games is one that a lot of people are throwing out there, and it's not necessarily because, we wouldn't get this in the 4-team. We obviously missed the mark in a couple of different years. Last year we had two great ones, but at the end of the day, you do look at this and say, in a 12-team playoff, these teams have the ability to get their feet under them. They have the ability to kind of fight through some different things and maybe not play their best football to start this thing, but finally hit their stride and really play great football down the stretch, and maybe it'll make for tighter games in the semifinal games. Maybe these teams won't have that entire month off and then have to jump into a big-time game, and then you could lead to a couple of blowouts here and there. But on the other side of this, you have Texas that has been able to get ready and be able to play a couple of games before Ohio State. You have Ohio State that was able to play Tennessee and play Oregon and get their feet under them, and they didn't really need that, to be totally fair, but it did give an ability for both these teams to know what they're doing wrong, know what they're doing right, and attack at the at the fullest extent. So I do think it was a very, very fun thing. I do think it's something that will help these games be a little bit tighter down the stretch, and a big reason why I'm not necessarily saying the national title is going to be some type of blowout, because I think both these teams have found their stride throughout this thing, and I think it's going to be really, really hard to be able to pull away from these teams just because of how crisp they're playing at this very moment. Now, the flip side of that argument is you're playing too much football. You're getting these guys a little bit hurt, and frankly, I probably want to talk about that on Friday in a little bit more detail, but it's definitely something to think about. But these incredible semifinal games are absolutely an argument that the 12-team playoff is doing what it was designed to do. But then you have the anti-expansion group that absolutely has plenty of arguments as well coming out of this thing. The early round blowouts is probably the biggest one of the bunch, and it's one that I've talked about a little bit, and it's one I don't care about, if I'm being totally honest, because you want to look around every single playoff scenario, including NFL wildcard this past weekend. We got one good game. That's the reality of playoffs in a lot of different respects, where we got that Buccaneers-Commanders game, and that was about it. Now, it's not to say that, we don't have great games from different times in the NFL wildcard or in early rounds of playoffs, and I think we will have them in the CFP, but you look at the first round of the CFP, no elite games, not by any means, but I don't necessarily think that's an indictment of the postseason. I don't think that's something that will bury the 12-team, and I think it's something that was happening in the 4-team was definitely going to happen in the 12-team, so if you didn't expect that, I don't know what to tell you, if I'm being totally honest. But anti-expansionist group will absolutely push this and say this is a big-time reason they'll push for doing away with auto buys, do away with different things that create a little bit more of a gap between these first-round matchups. Then you do have the title is proof that there is diminished importance on the regular season. It just is. So you have a Notre Dame team that lost to NIU. You have an Ohio State team that lost to Michigan at the very end of the year. There is a lot of people, and I'm sort of in this group. I kind of battle back and forth in this, that if those things are going to happen, if you're going to allow a Michigan team that has essentially no pass game to beat you, if you're going to allow an NIU team where you were coming off a win over A&M to beat you on your home field, maybe you don't deserve a chance to compete for a national title. So that's kind of the other argument that you can have, is the regular season for these teams in particular, not necessarily for the grandiose respect, but for these teams in particular, was diminished a little bit. The importance of every single game was diminished a little bit because Ohio State found their way in with 2 losses against, and especially one at the very end of the year that every single other year would have buried them. There's no doubt about that. And then NIU is one that it would have buried Notre Dame. And every single other year, even if they win 11-1, a lot of people will be arguing that they don't deserve to be in. It would have been an argument a little bit more so for Notre Dame, but it is proof that that Michigan loss, that NIU loss do not mean nearly as much as they used to mean. And it is proof that a lot of the worries of the diminished regular season, at least in certain circumstances for certain teams, is kind of coming to fruition. So we can argue back and forth on that. I think it's obviously a little bit more important for teams in the ACC and the Big 12, but it's a little less important for teams like Ohio State, Notre Dame, even Texas, Georgia, a couple of those teams that can bounce back from a couple of losses and still find their way in, and then they really hit their stride and win a national title. So this is one where you can go back and forth on, but it is proof that for certain teams, these regular season games don't mean quite as much as they used to mean. This is the most important one to me, at least in my estimation, that we have to find a way to keep energy in conferences. We have to find a way to keep the necessary energy in those championship games, because those should matter. Winning the SEC, winning the Big 10, winning the Big 12, winning the ACC, winning the AAC, winning the Sun Belt, all of that stuff should really matter, because that's what college football is. College football is conferences. College football is, it's not anymore, but in a lot of ways, it is regionality. It is beating the people that are right around you, and it's being able to stand on top of the mountaintop, not of the sport overall, but of the guys around you, of your peers, and that is a big deal. We have to find a way to keep a little bit of energy in this one, and it obviously was a disadvantage this year. You know, Oregon played a great game against Penn State, and then they get the toughest draw of anyone in the tournament, while Penn State gets the easiest draw. So there is an argument here, and it's definitely one that I very much hold. You know, I want conference championships to mean as much as possible. I want them to mean everything in this sport, and this year they just didn't as much, and that's a very upsetting thing and something we're going to have to deal with going forward. But overall, there's arguments on both sides, no doubt about it, and there was always going to be arguments on both sides. It'll take a couple of years for us to figure out exactly what this is going to look like, exactly the pros and cons, at least in no uncertain terms. But the way that I look at this first season, and the grade that I would give this first season for the 12-team playoff, is a C+. I think it was great. I think it was fun. I had no doubt about it. I think we did some great things. I think there were some not so great things. You know, you had those first round blowouts. You had a couple of things that made it a little bit less fun, a little bit less entertaining, a little bit less interesting, and I do think there are massive issues with the format. I do think you have to do away with auto buys. Overall seeding might need to change, maybe reseeding, maybe change with the home games and that type of thing, but overall, I think we did a good job. For the first year in the 12-team playoff, I think they did a good job. I think we've had some incredible games. I would pick the same 12 teams, and I would have it play out the same way, and I would have no problem with that. But there are issues to figure out. There are things that are keeping this from being the best version of a playoff that it possibly could be, and not affecting the regular season as much as you would like it to. It's obviously going to impact it some, but definitely would like to tamper that down as much as possible. So I do think the pros outweigh the cons just by a little bit. I've had an incredible amount of fun doing this, and frankly, to start this year, I was not a 12-team playoff guy. I did not love the idea. Coming out of this year, I don't necessarily love it. It's not the perfect way I would go about business, but it is a lot better. It is something that I think much highlier of, and I do think it did a great job in the first year, but there are issues to figure out. So I have it at a C+. I think it's right above that average. I do think next year it could be a B+, and then after that it could be an A+. I really do think there are very concrete, very easy things to kind of flip over. Auto buy system, you know, finding a way to give more credence to conference champions, whatever that looks like, finding a way to kind of smooth over the edges. I think this could be an A-plus product in a couple of years. But right now, we still have some kinks to work out. It was a great year, and I hope it finishes off very, very strong. But definitely some things to figure out, and we'll obviously talk about a couple of those things in a little bit more depth as they unfold. But let's get our first break here, and when we come back, let's talk about that Big Ten versus SEC battle that is going on right now. The Big Ten has taken control of the sport. The question now becomes, how long will it last? Will it only get greater over time, or will it kind of bounce back and forth between the big two? And we'll talk about that right after this, so stick with us.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits, I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip, you choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about the CFP in the very first year, gave a grade for it. I'm going to go with the C+. I do think it was a very successful year. I think it did what it was supposed to do, and I think it gave us a lot of great things. There are some kinks to figure out, and I think it could be an A+ product in a couple of years once we figure out those kinks. Have to assume there's going to be more teams in that thing, but we'll figure it out when time comes, and definitely some things that we'll talk about. Probably next week I'll get into what I would do with the playoff, what I would do with conference real, a lot of different things. I'll talk about next week kind of in the future of this sport. But how long will the Big Ten reign last is something that I want to talk about here for a second, because it's been established at this point that the Big Ten has passed the SEC. They are the top conference in the country. They are back in the. They could have back-to-back national champions. The SEC has been sitting on the sideline the last 2 years for that game. So it's been pretty clear. The Big Ten has jumped the SEC. The question now becomes, how far have they jumped the SEC, and how long will it last for them being above the SEC and not, will it bounce back and forth? Will it be the Big Ten just kind of carrying the weight for a very long time? And I think there's a good argument both ways, if I'm being totally honest. I really do think the Big Ten is set up for a lot of success in the NIL era, in the era just coming forward for the next couple of years. And the SEC has plenty of arguments as well, that they will bounce right back and be able to play what the advantages that the Big Ten was able to take advantage of. Same thing the SEC will try to do over the next 5 years or so. But let's first get into why the Big Ten can stay on top, the reasons the Big Ten could stay on top, and I think this is one that gets a little bit overlooked, but the big city appeal in the NIL era is a big deal. There's no doubt about that. You have a lot of schools that are very, very close to the city of Chicago up there in the Big Ten, a couple of schools very close to Indianapolis, a couple of schools close to New York City. When you talk about Rutgers and Maryland and a couple other schools like that, Maryland next to Baltimore. So you do have a lot of people that say, the NIL era is all about, where you are. It's all about the connections that you have and the ability that you have to kind of garner those connections. That happens in big-time cities. That's the reality. There's no doubt about that. Anthony, I'm only seeing one of your comments here, but I will address this one real quick. I don't think it'll last as long as people think. I think the SEC is having a down year, and I think they're going to be at the top of the conference. I totally understand that take, and I'll actually get into a big reason I tend to believe that you might just be right, Anthony, here in a second. But for the NIL era, I just think being around big cities is a huge part of that. Now, you do have Atlanta, Nashville, Austin very much in SEC country. So it's not to say the SEC can't take advantage of this. It's not to say the ACC couldn't take advantage with Atlanta being in there and a couple of Miami being in there and a couple others. But it feels like the Big Ten has the most ability ability to tap into what these big cities have to offer up in the north and take advantage of those for NIL opportunities. I don't know if the gap is absolutely massive, but I do think it's noticeable, and it has been told that a lot of recruits that are looking at different schools are looking at those Big Ten schools because you might have a little bit more proximity to a couple of the nightlife and NIL things that you'd love to have in a big city that you might not have as much in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. But another reason they will is you have bright futures for pretty much every contender in this conference. So Ohio State, obviously on the cusp of a title, and they're Ohio State. They always have a bright future. I'm not going to worry about Ohio State. Penn State is looking great for 2025, and I think beyond. I really do love what Ethan Gronkmeyer can bring to that team, and I really think they're going to be incredible teams to watch. And Anthony, here's the other couple of questions, but for the playoff, I think what should have happened is ASU I don't care that ASU and Boise State won the conference, they shouldn't have gotten the bye, and that I fully agree with that statement, if I'm being totally honest. I don't think auto buys are a good idea, and I do think Texas and Penn State should have gotten those Final Four spots. What I will say is I do think we should reward those teams, so maybe you give Boise State and Arizona State a home game, but not a bye, and that's something we can iron out, definitely something that I'll talk about next week when I get into my official plans for the CFP going forward. But as in terms of the contenders in the Big Ten and what they look like going forward, you obviously, Penn State looking great in 2025, and I think beyond, they're going to be more than fine. Oregon with Dan Lanning feels like they continue to roll in the right direction, a little bit slower than they might want, but still rolling in the right direction. And then Michigan with Bryce Underwood, obviously is going to be a huge part of this, definitely a guy that can elevate that program in a lot of different ways. And then you have Illinois, Indiana, Nebraska, which is a huge one to watch over the next couple of years. If they elevate, the Big Ten might be able to stay on top for a very, very long time. But then you do have Wisconsin and a couple other teams that very well could elevate a little bit more and help out that bottom half of the Big Ten that has been a little bit lacking comparative to the SEC in the past couple of years. But then the SEC has plenty as well. There's no doubt about that. UGA and Bama just waning just a little bit has opened this door, and I definitely do think there's a little bit more of a bright future with the top contenders in the Big Ten than they are in the SEC, but it's a really tight margin if I'm being totally honest, and you'll find with this, it's going to be a tight margin for a very long time in this argument. But then you got expansion argument here, and it's for the Big Ten, the biggest thing is you're going to be the front of the line for expansion opportunities. Now, I don't necessarily think that's going to happen. I don't necessarily, especially this offseason, I don't expect a lot of movement. I think the Mountain West and the MAC could get involved and get a couple of teams here and there. I don't see the Big Ten or the SEC getting involved very much this offseason. I think it'll be more about the Big Ten and the SEC fighting the ACC and the Big 12 more than anything else. But I do think there will be a little bit of fighting, but when you look into the future, Big Ten will be the first choice for a team like UNC, for a team like Miami, for just about every team because they are the number one in money. There's no doubt about that, and they're definitely a team or a conference that will have their pick of the litter in a lot of different ways. Now, they do have the academic requirements that make it a little bit tougher, have to be an AAU school if you want to be in the Big Ten, but if they were able to just malign that just a little bit, change that just a little bit, I do think there would be a conversation to be had, and I think they could become a power conference that would be nearly impossible to stop. But Anthony has one here. I think a Cinderella season for Indiana, or I think this was a Cinderella season for Indiana. I think they go back to being 8. I fully understand that, and that's something that definitely is something to watch, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. Definitely something I want to get into because they look like a good team going into 2025, but a lot of different questions, no doubt about that. And then, yeah, absolutely. I fully agree that the Big Ten, I think Miami, I think Clemson is a much better fit in the SEC as well as Florida State. I think when you look at the Big Ten, probably North Carolina, Virginia, those type of teams feel like better fits, but definitely is a world where the Big Ten is going to get all of the teams that want to be in a new conference are going to look at the Big Ten first in a lot of different ways. But then we got to get to the SEC, and while they'll bounce back, and we'll get to that question about 2025 here in a second, Anthony, but elite fan buy-in is a huge part of this because in the NIL world, you need people that are just coming to your games to donate just that little bit more, to go to the NIL fund, to go to the collective to help this team get a little bit better. So that's kind of the biggest thing here is these SEC teams are not used to being bad. That's just the reality. Auburn has a title in this century. Florida has been remarkable in this past century, and even it feel like they're turning a corner just about right now. And then you do have Georgia, you do have Bama, Texas, Oklahoma. All of these teams are very used to success. They're very used to winning 9 games, winning 10 games, getting into the national conversation, and they don't really accept anything less. So you look at Auburn right now. Auburn has Hugh Freeze, and it feels like things are sort of moving in the right direction. Did a great job in the portal, did a great job all over the place. If they don't win next year, he will be fired, and they will go out and get the biggest guy that they can possibly get. They will attack that thing the same exact way they attacked the Hugh Freeze hire, and they will continue to do that until they get it right. I think that is a small difference between the SEC and the Big Ten is I don't think the SEC is going to rest until they are back on top of this sport. I don't think these fans are going to rest. I don't think the administration or these teams are really going to rest because the reality is these fans are just so insane. I lived in SEC country. I went to an SEC school. I am telling you, these fans will not accept anything but being the top team in the country, but being one of the top programs in the country, and I do think that will play a little bit of a part. It's not to say that Big Ten fans are bad or Big Ten fans aren't bought in as much, but it is to say that I think these schools down in the SEC are getting a little bit mad right about now, and I think these fans are getting a little bit mad, and I think they're going to take over just a little bit over the next little bit and be very, very mad. A lot of money will be going into the NIL funds for all these SEC schools. And the Billy Napier conversation is one that I'm watching with a fine-tooth comb. I'm very interested in what that holds. Now, let's talk about the 2025 season because that does have something to do with Billy Napier because that's a big thing here is I think the SEC has elite quarterback play coming in 2025 and beyond 2025. I think they will have the best quarterbacks in the country, and you tend to find that the best quarterbacks in the country find their way to being the best teams in the country. Now, there are questions, no doubt about that, and you look at the Big Ten, you do have Bryce Underwood, you do have Julian Sayin, you do have a guy like Aiden Childs that I think could elevate over the next couple of years. So there's a lot of different things that are going on in the Big Ten that there's great quarterback play there. It's a little bit different in the SEC in 2025 and going forward. DJ Lagway, Nico Iamaleava, Arch Manning, Lenoris Sellers, Keelan Russell is a guy at Alabama that, frankly, I think he's going to be the starter for them in 2025, but that's someone we have time to talk about, I promise. But Deuce Knight is a guy coming up in the Auburn ranks. I just think the quarterback play at the SEC is going to be ridiculous over the next 2, 3, 4 years, and I don't think it's going to go anywhere. And I think when you look at the world of college football, you got the quarterback, you got a lot of things heading in the right direction. So that's a huge reason for me, and Anthony, it's a huge reason why the SEC might just bounce right back on top. You know, Texas could be the dominant team in the country next year, and we'll talk about Texas likely on Friday because a lot of guys going out the door, and it will define what 2025 looks like. But overall, really elite quarterback play coming in the next couple of years in the SEC, and I really do think that will tip the scales just a little bit towards the SEC in this one. And then the recruiting footprint advantage is just the reality. I think we all understand this at this point. The SEC has the most the most states to pull from with the best talent. You know, you have Florida, you have Georgia, you have Texas, Louisiana, you have all of the big-time states. California is one that's a little bit far away, but they've done a great job kind of tapping into that. They have the most guys right near them. And obviously, it is a national recruiting. You know, the world of recruiting has entirely changed. It's not necessarily you have to be connected by area to be recruited by that team. Lots of Georgia guys, lots of Florida guys going to Texas, lots of Ohio State guys come from Georgia and Florida and all of those different places. So it's not to say the Big Ten can't tap into that, but it does give the SEC a little bit of a leg up. It does give the SEC ability to build these teams from the ground up a little bit stronger, a little bit faster, a little bit more able than the Big Ten will be able to do over the next couple of years. And obviously the NIL and portal era changes that just a little bit, but the recruiting advantage is still very much there. And overall, my final take around all of this is I think it's going to bounce back and forth. I'm kind of with Anthony here in some sense. I don't know what 2025 looks like because I love what Oregon, I love what Penn State, Ohio State are doing. But at the end of the day, I think when you look at what the SEC brings, they're not going to be down for long. These fans will not allow it. These administrations will not allow it. And these coaches will not allow it. And I really think the talent level will continue to rise in the SEC. I think that quarterback play will make a huge push. But overall, you know, the SEC dominance was not a mirage. That's something that I've seen on Twitter a little bit, that the SEC, we were just lying to people that the SEC was the best conference in the country. It was for about 15 years. Now, the big difference is Nick Saban's not in the SEC anymore, and that is a huge, huge piece of this. Let's just be totally honest. The SEC for a long time was Alabama, Georgia, and about nobody else, at least on the national scale. But the reality is he is out of the sport. I still think there's a number of things that will push the SEC to find their way back to the top, and maybe it's 2025, maybe it's 2026, but I don't think any conference is going to stay on top of this sport for very long. I think it's going to bounce back and forth between these two entities for quite some time, and it'll make for some great Twitter arguments for which one is actually the better conference in some time. But definitely a very odd debate, and definitely one that is really hard to get a full beat on. You know, you never really know what the NIL and what the transfer portal era will hold. You never know if the Big Ten's going to go out and get Miami tomorrow. You never know what's going to happen in this sport. But overall, I do think it's going to bounce back and forth in a number of different ways. And you're totally right about Arch Manning. You know, he looks like a great player. Every time you've seen him, it looks absolutely incredible. There's a lot of pressure on that kid, and it will be very interesting to see what he looks like in 2025. I think he'll be a great player. I don't know if he'll live up to the hype that everyone has for him, because I don't know if anyone really can live up to the hype that everyone has for him. But at the end of the day, it will be really interesting to watch all of this unfold. And And Anthony, yeah, I do think there is an argument to be made that the Big Ten might have a bigger scope. You know, getting those California teams did open up a lot of doors in the Pacific Northwest and just the Pacific Coast in a lot of ways. So it'll be interesting to see the effect that that has. But as of right now, I think it's fair to say the talent pool, at least from a high school level, in the SEC is just a little bit better than what the Big Ten will have at their disposal. But let's take our second break here. This is obviously something we will talk about in more depth and time, but let's take our second break here. And when we come back, let's do a little bit of a coaching carousel wrap-up. And I say wrap-up very questionably, but let's do a little bit of a wrap-up, go to all the big-time hires that have happened throughout this cycle, and we'll talk about a couple of people that are still guys to watch in this coaching carousel right after this, so stick with us.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about the Big Ten versus the SEC. I think the Big Ten is fully on top right now. I'm not sure it's going to last that long. I don't think anyone's going to last that long at the top of this sport for the next decade or so. I do think we'll have a lot of bouncing back and forth. The question is, when will it bounce back to the SEC, and how obvious will it be that it bounced back to the SEC will be a big thing to watch. But let's get to a little bit of a coaching carousel. I'll call it a wrap-up, but there could be some twists and turns even today. There could be some twists and turns in this thing, but let's go ahead and get into this. And it's been a weird coaching cycle because hasn't been necessarily a lot of openings. You know, you had North Carolina, you had Purdue, you had West Virginia, UCF, but you didn't have necessarily big-time jobs that opened, and that's something we'll talk about at the end of this. But overall, there's a lot of different things to talk about, and it was a very interesting cycle. If it wasn't, you know, a lot of different hires, the hires that were made were very, very fascinating to watch unfold. And we'll start with the Power Five. I am going to expand it to the Washington State and Oregon State just to make things a little bit easier on myself. But for the hires that have happened around those, obviously North Carolina and Bill Belichick steal the show. There's no doubt about that. There's already been talk around him in the NFL. I'll be totally honest. I think the hire is very cool. I think it's going to be interesting to watch, and I'm very, very questionable of it. I think it's going to be one of those things that I don't think it's all that long-lived. I don't think he stays there beyond 2025. Obviously, I'd love to be proved wrong on that because I'd love to have Bill Belichick stick around in college football for quite some time and become a big-time coach in this sport. But I just don't see it being the case. I think there will be an opening in the NFL at some point that he will jump at. I tend to believe it will be after this year, but this year is going to be really fun to watch. There's no doubt about that. So enjoy it all while you can, because I have a feeling that Bill Belichick will not be around in college football for much longer. But moving forward, you do have Purdue bringing back Barry Odom. Or not bringing back Barry Odom, but hiring Barry Odom from UNLV. You had West Virginia get Rich Rod from Jacksonville State, and it's two very interesting hires. It's two hires that I think could really could really right the ship at both those places. I think when you talk about what Barry Odom and Purdue could do, I really think he's going to bring that hard-nosed football a little bit back to them. I think they'll be able to meet some of these Big Ten teams where they are, at least in terms of physicality. The size will be a little bit of an issue, and definitely something they're going to have to figure out. He's picked up a number of big-time transfers, has had a number of guys walk out the door. So I don't expect them to explode onto the scene in 2024, but I do think it was a good stabilizing hire, and I think it's one that could pay dividends down the road. And then for Rich Rodriguez, he has a chance to turn this thing around pretty quickly. Now, he's got his work cut out for him. There's a lot of different moving parts, a lot of guys that are walking out the door, and a lot of new coaches coming in, including Zach Alley, which I think was a massive win. I do think when you coach in the Big 12, when you coach in the Big 12, you're just a couple of guys away at any given moment. You're just a couple of plays away from possibly making a run at a CFP spot, and I'm not saying that West Virginia is going to do that in 2025, but at the end of the day, there's a couple of different buttons he could press, and if he does, I think these things could really happen in a hurry. Then you move forward to UCF, and they get their guy back. Scott Frost is back in Central Florida, and it's going to be really interesting. I didn't necessarily think it was a home run hire, but with Gus Malzahn leaving, you kind of had to do what you had to do. And I do think it's a very interesting hire. I think it's one that a lot of recruits will respond to, because not only can you say, I've had success in college football, you can say, I've had success in this place. I know what it looks like to get this team to 13-0, to be talked about on the national stage, and to be respected the way that you fully deserve to be respected. And I think that's a big-time part of this, where Scott Frost is a very, very good head coach, and when he goes into those rooms with recruits and their parents, he can say, UCF is a place where you can go undefeated because I went undefeated here. So I do think that is something to watch, and definitely will be a very interesting team to watch in 2025. Then you do have Wake Forest hiring Jake Dickert from Washington State, and then Washington State went out and hired Jamie Rogers from South Dakota State. So like a little bit of a flip there, but I think both really, really solid hires. I think Jimmy Rogers is a guy that you will see continue to elevate in this sport. I would love to see what he will do in the new Pac-12 in a couple of years, but Jake Dickert is a guy that I think was a great hire. I think when you had a couple of guys move on from that program, it was in a weird place. You know, Dave Clawson was such an anchor for that program for such a long time that it was going to be a very interesting coaching search. I think they found a very good guy. I think they found a guy that is going to be willing to stick around there for a little bit longer than some other guys would, and I think he's at least going to be able to make them a fighting chance in the ACC. I don't expect them to really fight for a title in 2025, but I do think they're going to be a more frisky team, and I think moving forward, we'll hear from Wake Forest just that little bit more like we had during different times during Dave Clawson's time there. But overall, really fun group. Hypothetically, I think there could be a couple more NFL swoops, and we'll talk about that here in a second. But overall, I do think it's one of those groups that you might not, hear all the headlines about. You might not get hit over the head other than Bill Belichick with a lot of the different talk around these guys, but I think they're very interesting hires. I think they're a lot of good hires, and it'll be fascinating to see how they unfold. But moving to the group of 5 level, because there were a lot of hires there as well. App State got Dowell Loggins from South Carolina. Love this hire. Might have been my favorite hire of the entire cycle. I think Dowell Loggins is a fantastic coach. The job he did with Lenore Sellers was downright incredible, and I think he's going to do a great job at App State, and might just continue to elevate in this college football world very shortly. Very talented coach, and cannot wait to see what he can do. Matt Entz is back in the head coaching realm with Fresno State after a weird year for Fresno State without Jeff Tedford, left before the year with some health concerns, and then obviously they made their way through the year, played a relatively good year, but now they officially have their head coach moving forward. Love this guy. Very, very talented head coach, did a great job at NDSU, and absolutely will do a great job here. And then then UNLV got the guy. Dan Mullen is the one that was the most interesting hire of the cycle outside of Bill Belichick, of course, but a great hire for them. He's doing incredible things in the portal right now, picking up some guys that if you hit the right buttons, they could be downright special. But definitely something to watch there, a hire that I absolutely love and cannot wait to see how that one unfolds. Charles Huff was a situation that was very much talked about and around bowl season that Marshall did not want to pay him. So he walked out the door to Southern Miss, as did a lot of those players. They had to forfeit their bowl game. Been talked about a lot, but definitely a coach that I think can scale that program, and then I think the sky's the limit for Charles Huff. And then down to the FCS level, you have South Dakota State. They did hire Dan Jackson, very talented head coach, absolutely a guy that can have a lot of success there. And then what did coach there for some time was the DC at Idaho, so has been around the FCS, has played some, or has coached some really good football. Cannot wait to see what he can do. But Sacramento State is the one I want to talk about because Brennan Marion's doing some special things over there. He was hired there for a very specific purpose because they had some money to spend, and he has been spending it. They're building, I don't want to say a monster. I don't necessarily know if they're going to win an FCS title this year, but man, it looks like a program that is very much heading in the right direction and would not be surprised necessarily if they found their way to a title at some point in the next little bit. Then major coordinator hires, and there's still a couple out there not filled, or Penn State DC, Oklahoma DC, a couple of different positions out there that we'll be watching very closely over the next week or so. But then you look at the rest of the jobs. The Florida State OC is Gus Malzahn. I know that sounds a little bit crazy, but he left UCF as the head coach to become the OC at Florida State. I think it makes a lot of sense. I think him and Mike Norvell will work very well together, and he'll be able to take a little bit more pressure off Mike Norvell when it comes to game calling and game planning as you get close to these games. Oklahoma might have made the coordinator hire of the cycle with Ben Arbuckle, obviously brought in John Mateer with that as well, so they did more than fine on that realm. Now, you have some issues to figure out, no doubt about that, beyond those two guys, but love this hire and definitely one that I think could pay huge dividends for this team. Chip Lindsey is taking over the Bryce Underwood era over there at Michigan, and he did a great job at UNC, but there were different moments where they struggled at times. The offensive line is going to be huge. If they can get that offensive line rolling, it is going to be a lethal offense for them, and it'll be really fun to watch what he can do with Bryce Underwood in year one and obviously beyond that. Then Clemson got the hire yesterday with Tom Allen. Very, very good hire for them. Definitely one that at the very least brings in different ideas, and Clemson has been really missing that piece of this. So really respect this hire by Dabo Swinney. I think it's a little bit different than what he's been doing, and it's a very, very good one. Obviously, North Carolina hires Steve Belichick. Very good hire for them. Also, I forgot one. Washington did hire Ryan Walters to replace Steve Belichick. So the old Purdue head coach has gotten a job. Fantastic defensive coordinator, and I expect big things from Washington next year. And then you do have Miami DC, Corey Heatherman. That was another hire that happened this week. So very, very solid hire. It'll be very interesting to see what he can do down there in Coral Gables. But that's about what you got right now. There's still a couple of straggling coordinator hires, and there possibly could be a couple of head coaching hires, and let's get into that right now. The names to watch are Deion Sanders is one of the biggest ones. The Cowboys have spoken to Deion Sanders about their new opening with Mike McCarthy moving on. It doesn't sound like it's going to materialize into anything, but Deion Sanders has also not said that he is absolutely staying in Boulder. He has said that he loves Boulder, he loves his team, he loves the fan base, he loves the student body. He never said that he wasn't taking the job. So it will be an interesting thing to watch. I think a lot of the energy right now around that Cowboys job is around Kellen Moore, the former offensive coordinator for them. But as of right now, it's definitely something to watch, and we'll keep our eye out on it very closely, and obviously beyond 2025 very closely on this one. Marcus Freeman is another one we've talked about just a little bit. Regardless, it'll happen after the national title, if anything, but NFL jobs have been calling. Whether it's a defensive coordinator or a head coaching job, I don't think he's leaving for a coordinator job. I do think there is a world where he leaves for a head coaching job if it's the right situation. I don't know if the Bears is that. I don't know if a couple of different jobs would be that, but I expect him to be the head coach of Notre Dame in 2025, but definitely something that's still, at the very least, a little bit up in the air, maybe 5% up in the air right now. Ryan Day is another one that is a very hypothetical question. I don't think he's leaving. I don't think the fans really want him to leave at this point. Now, they might want him to leave if he loses on Monday, but at the end of the day, there have been ideas floated out there. There have been opportunities that have been out there, so it'll be interesting. I don't expect him to leave as well, but definitely something to watch as we get into this. And then Steve Sarkisian is another one that has been brought up with the Cowboys job, another one that I just don't expect to materialize. I think when you look at what Texas has been doing over the last couple of years, a lot of it's been getting ready for this Arch era. Let's just be totally honest, and I don't think Steve's leaving right before they get into that. So I do think he'll stick around at least for the Arch era, and then maybe in 1 or 2 years, maybe you do see him elevate to the NFL level. I think if you were to leave Texas, that's exactly where he would go, not to another college in college football. So definitely something to watch around there. And overall, the coaching carousel didn't have a ton of jobs to fill, especially at the head coaching era, but there was a lot of really fun ones. Bill Belichick was the wild one, but Dan Mullen to UNLV, Scott Frost coming back to UCF, as well as Rich Rod back to WVU, and then you go all the way down. Mike Vick got a job at Norfolk State. So a lot of different things that have happened in this cycle that has been very, very weird. There could still be that explosion. Maybe Steve Sarkisian does take that Cowboys job and moves on from Texas, and then dominoes will fall. It will be absolutely Armageddon around college football. I don't expect that to happen. I do think we have a relatively calm end to this coaching carousel, but you never know. There's always that landmine that they step over it, then the entire college football world could go into chaos. But let's take our third break here, and when we come back, let's just talk about how we'll go back to the national title. Let's talk about how each of these teams got to the national title, like a little look back on their season, just their schedule, their CFP run, some of the storylines they had to overcome, and all of the different things in between, and we'll talk about it right after this, so stick with us.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about the coaching carousel, hopefully did a little bit of a wrap-up on the coaching carousel. There's still a couple of stragglers that could send an absolute bomb into the college football world, but as of right now, I feel like we're coming to a relatively comfortable end, so hopefully there's no craziness, and if there is, obviously we will talk about it on here. But at the end of the day, I do want to get into just how both these teams got here, how both the national title teams found their way to Atlanta and are going to face off in this game on Monday. And it was two very similar paths in a lot of different ways. Not perfect throughout a couple of different points this season, but found their way to play the best football at the right moment. So it's a lot of similar narratives throughout these two teams, but two very, very different teams, two very different attacks, two very different paths in a lot of different ways. So let's go ahead and jump into this thing, and we'll start with Ohio State and just do a quick overlook of the games that they played in the regular season. Not a lot to think of in the first 5 games there. Obviously, they very much dominated their competition, did not give up a lot of points. That Marshall game started a little bit slow, and people started to get a little bit worried, but they handled business there, had no problems, and moved on forward. They played great, great football. Then you got to October 12th, and everyone knew that that was the game that everyone was looking forward to. We were very much hoping that they both got in there undefeated. They very much did, and now it was an incredible battle. It was one of the best games of the year. They come out on the wrong side with just a little bit of a late slide from Will Howard. That obviously puts them in a weird spot. It puts them in a spot where you don't know how many games you have to win to get into the Big Ten championship. You don't know how many games you have to win to get into the CFP. There's a million different questions, especially with that Penn State game staring down. And then you come back after a bye week and you beat Nebraska by 4 points. And then you really have questions, and you're wondering, is this team even close to a national title team? Will they be able to hit their stride when they very much need to? Because it feels like they're waning at the very wrong moment. Then they go to State College, get that big-time win over Penn State. A little bit precarious at times, got down by 10, but controlled the majority of that game and really kind of handled it the same way they have in a number of years over Penn State. Purdue was Purdue at the end of the day. Northwestern was a team that just didn't have much of a shot in that game. Was a weird game over there in Wrigley Field, but definitely was one that Ohio State was going to win and definitely did. Carnell Tate's a little bit of a breaking out party in that game. And then you did have Indiana handle business there. A little bit of a scare early, but finished off very, very strong. And then the Michigan game came. And it was a lot of different questions about a lot of the different things that what was going to happen with this team. Was Ryan Day going to get fired before the CFP even started? Or if they lost to Tennessee, was he going to get fired and then he gets fired and all of the guys that came back for one more year are walking out the door with nothing to show for it? They wouldn't have the win over Oregon. They would have the win over Penn State, but that's become pretty routine at this point. They wouldn't have the win over Michigan in the last 4 years. They wouldn't have a Big Ten title. They wouldn't have a national title. And all of that is still on the table. As upsetting as that is for all of the Ohio State fans out there, everyone knows Ohio State has 3 goals any given year, as does pretty much any elite team in any given conference. You want to beat your rival at the very end of the year, whether that's Michigan for Ohio State or Auburn for Alabama or Alabama for Auburn, what have you. You want to win your conference championship, so you want to win the Big Ten, you want to win the SEC, the Big 12, whatever, and then you want to win the national title. Those are the 3 goals for Ohio State. Those are the 3 goals for Michigan, for Texas, for Georgia, for Alabama, for all of these teams, and Ohio State only has 1. They only have 1 that they could possibly get, and you're looking forward and saying it was a title or bust year. You still have the ability to get the title, but man, if you don't, there's going to be a lot of questions about what this team is going forward and a lot of questions around Ryan Day going forward. But overall, they made it through the regular season, 10-2, not the season that they wanted by any means, but they found their way into the dance. They got a home game against Tennessee, and then the juggernaut started, and they just took over the sport in a hurry. Ohio State wins 42-17 over Tennessee, 41-21 over Oregon, then 28-14 over Texas. A little bit of a tougher battle against Texas, no doubt about that. But these were, at the very least 2, but probably 3 of the best performances that we've had all year. The first 2 were the best the team has looked in 2024 by a fairly comfortable margin. In a lot of different ways, they were downright unstoppable. And that team is the one that everyone imagined as we went into this year was this $20 million roster. It's going to tear people to pieces as long as Will Howard plays elite football. He really has down the stretch of the season, and he's been the biggest piece of this. If he can handle the noise, if he can bounce back and not make those big-time mistakes, he is going to be a guy that makes all the change in the world for this game and already has for the season. Has been a huge, huge effect on this team and definitely has been huge for this team as they've gone through what has been a weird season. Not the one that they wanted. You come up on your goals and you had 3 of them going in. You only have 1 of them ahead, but at the end of the day, you get that one. It's probably the sweetest one of the bunch. Although some people would argue that Michigan win was a little bit sweeter. But moving forward to storylines that they had to deal with throughout this year, the O-line injuries. Everyone's talking about Notre Dame's O-line injuries because they're a little bit more on top of the brain with a couple of guys that have gone out, but Ohio State has dealt with a lot as well. Josh Simmons was downright an NFL, maybe a first-round pick, and he might still be a first-round pick, frankly, at left tackle that forced Donovan Jackson to kick out there. Then you had Seth McLaughlin go down, and you're thinking, is this offensive line even going to be able to block anyone, especially the elite defensive lines that they were facing throughout the CFP? It was a huge worry for me, but they've handled business. They've done a great, great job, and it's definitely been a huge piece of why they've made this run and why they've been able to find a stabilizing force is Donovan Jackson's done great at that left tackle position, and a lot of the guys that have, Carson Hinsman's done a great job at center. It's been a huge, huge success for them, but obviously a big-time challenge coming up on Monday. And then the Jeremiah Smith show. This was the one that kind of stole everyone's heart throughout the year for Ohio State is they have an alien on their team. They have a guy that can do things that I did not know were possible and I don't think should be possible, but at the end of the day, he was a show all year, especially in the CFP, and he's going to be a guy that I'm watching very, very closely just throughout his career, NFL and beyond. I cannot wait to see what this kid can do, and I've said it before, I'll say it again. Go ahead and make a gold jacket because he's going to need it in about 15 years. And then the Ryan Day question. This was the cloud over the entire season. It was coming in. It was definitely after the Oregon game. It was definitely after the Michigan game. And they had to deal with it. All these players had to deal with it because they knew. They weren't confused about what Ryan Day's job security was going into this year. They weren't confused what it was coming out of the Michigan game. They were all worried. I can absolutely promise you that. They want this guy to be their head coach. They obviously very much like him and definitely play really hard for him. But you're on the doorstep of a national title now, and a lot of that has been earned back. But you lose the national title, and you come up short of all 3 goals that you had. Even though you've played great football the last 3 games, you wouldn't have accomplished the 3 goals that Ohio State has to accomplish. So a lot of different things going into this one. More than anything, the Ohio State year was defined by resiliency in the regular season, just finding a way to get into the CFP, endure a couple of really tough battles. And then the CFP was just about anger. It was just about being as mad as can be about what has happened throughout this regular season and saying, we are going to tear you to pieces. And they have torn people to pieces. Now, Texas was able to put up a little bit more of a fight, but overall, the ultimate goal is still out there. You don't get that one, then all the stuff I just talked about, all the great things you battle through, all the great things that have come from this year do not matter at all. Then you move forward to Notre Dame, and their regular season was a little bit more straightforward than Ohio State's was, except for that Week 2 matchup. Obviously, it's been much talked about by this point, but NIU beating Notre Dame at the beginning of the season gave a lot of questions. There's no doubt about that. They were a team that it looked like they were in really, really dire straits after that game, and I think everyone understood, including them, that if you don't run the table, you are not getting into the CFP. They absolutely wouldn't have, as far as I'm concerned. They would have been kicked out for a team like Alabama, for a team like maybe Miami or Ole Miss or someone like that. I feel very confident in that. So you have a great win over A&M. You have some great wins over Louisville and over Georgia Tech. I think was a very solid win if you watch that one unfold. Obviously, the USC win at the end of the year was very nice, but overall, a lot of people had questions. A lot of people looked at the schedule and said, how impressive is it? Are they really going to be able to elevate their performance with the way they need to in the CFP? I had big questions about that as they went into the CFP, and they've been able to. They played really, really good football, but overall, I think it's one of those things that you hit that Stanford game. That was the game where it really just became lights out. They really started performing at their highest level. They started to tear through teams defensively. That USC game got a little bit away from them, but the reality is when you're facing Lincoln Riley, it's going to get away from you just a little bit. But overall, I think they're one of those teams that they played a couple of games that have looked a little sketchy at times, that Louisville, that USC game, and a couple others, but overall, they've been a really, really good team, and they made it happen after a Week 2 loss that they knew if they had one more, they were out of this thing. They were able to find their footing and play really great football down the stretch of this season. And it carried over into the CFP. They played great football throughout the last 3 games. Obviously, that Indiana game was a little bit closer on the scoreboard than it was on the field. Georgia, 23-10, definitely a kind of defining win for this program and for Marcus Freeman. And then that win over Penn State, one that was absolutely crazy all over the place, but they found a way to get it done. And the biggest thing about this team is just they found a way to get wins. That is a thing that cannot be overstated, especially in the CFP format. Cannot be overstated how important it is to just find a way to get 3 more points, find a way to get 1 more yard, find a way to get that third down conversion that you very badly need. That's what these games are about, and Notre Dame has done an incredible job of doing that throughout this CFP run. But we did have storylines throughout this. They're an injury-riddled team, man. They have been all over the place this year. It started with Charles Zagusa, who sounds like he is going to be the left tackle in that game, and we'll probably talk about that maybe on Monday. We'll just do kind of a quick wrap-up on that situation. But you had Charles Zagusa to start the season, then Benjamin Morrison, then Riley Mills, then Anthony Knapp. Guys have gone down left and right for this team. Very, very talented team, very deep team, so hasn't affected them too much, but it's been a year where they've had to battle through a lot of different things and a lot of different moments of the season, and they found their way to find their footing and play some really great football, especially on the defensive side of the ball without Benjamin Morrison and Riley Mills, who I would argue are the two of the 3 best players on that defense with Xavier Watts. Then you do have the 3-headed monster. The group of Riley Leonard, Jadarian Price, and Jeremiah Love have been as good as it gets in college football. They've been downright incredible throughout this year, and they've been a huge reason why Notre Dame just been able to be confident, being able to be who they are and be able to execute at a really high level. Is you don't have to be special when you have 3 different guys that can be special on their own. So you don't have to do anything special when it comes to play calling. Just let these guys do what they do, and they're going to get you a lot of great plays. And then the NIU Storm Cloud. This was a reality for this team, and it's something we've talked about, but they had to earn their respect back. They had to earn their respect back for all the people in the college football world. They had to earn their respect back for themselves. There's no doubt about that. And now you had that game against UGA and Penn State. That might have been the moment where a lot of people earned the respect back finally. But overall, that loss was downright devastating. It's the reason that they're here today. It's the reason that they've been able to battle back. And I'm not saying they should thank NIU. I am saying that Thomas Hammock being able to take down Notre Dame is a huge reason that Notre Dame is in this national championship. But overall, Notre Dame is a team that is just that. They're a team. They play together. They play 22 guys every single time. They are not scared to meet you in the hole. They're not scared to play really hard-nosed football. They execute at a super high level, and the reality is it's working for them. It's been incredible to watch, and both these teams have been awesome to watch throughout this year. It's been weird years. It's been a year that has not necessarily equated into all the things that they wanted to happen, especially for Ohio State, but at the end of the day, you still have that national title sitting right in front of you. You're 60 minutes away from being the team that's lifting that national title that lives on forever, and it's going to be incredible to watch, to talk about what's going to happen going forward. But overall, two incredible teams, and Anthony, you're absolutely right. That linebacking core is a huge reason that Notre Dame is in this spot, because the knowledge, the ability that comes from that linebacker core is so important, especially with the injuries that they've had throughout this year. But let's take our final break here, and when we come back, we got Wednesday questions. We'll roll through this relatively quickly, but we'll talk about some different things around the national championship, including can Notre Dame contain Jeremiah Smith right after this, so stick with us. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about how either of these teams got here. There were some bumps in the road for both these teams, no doubt about that. Some things they had to deal with, including a lot of injuries on both these teams, but they found their way to the national title, and I got some questions about this national title that I want to get into before tomorrow, which is going to just be a jamboree. It's just going to be everything around this game. It's going to be matchups, storylines, players to watch, my official pick, everything in between is going to happen on tomorrow's show, so it's going to be a little bit of a national title extravaganza. But let's go ahead and jump into this thing, and let's talk about some of the questions that I do have, and we'll talk about that one right here, Anthony. Can Notre Dame handle this guy? Can they control this guy? Can they keep this guy at bay? And the big time question is something that Anthony brought up here is Texas did a great job. They did triple cover him at different times. They did play two safeties over top. They played a safety over top. There were very few times that he was not at least bracketed or at least in the middle of three different guys in zone. He wasn't necessarily, manned up by three guys the same way you saw, I think, Calvin Johnson, that infamous picture. But at the end of the day, he was definitely someone that they keyed in on, and they absolutely tried to hold their own in, and they did a great job. One catch for 3 yards, and Notre Dame's looking at that and saying, how can we replicate that? The issue with that is the philosophy on these two teams are entirely different, and I've talked about this a little bit, but Notre Dame runs about 57% of the snaps out of man coverage. That is not something that has worked very well for teams that have faced Ohio State. Tennessee did this, Oregon did this, and we saw the results of that. It was very, very not pretty. It was definitely something that Ohio State loves to take advantage of, because if you're going to find two guys that can get separation better than Jeremiah Smith and Emeka Egbuka, you're not going to find those two guys, just plain and simple. Now, separation might not be the greatest thing about Jeremiah Smith, but let's be honest, he's pretty much separated the second that he leaves the line of scrimmage. So it's going to be really interesting to watch what happens, and and that's the goal, Anthony. It's always the goal to see, can we get everyone else to do what they do and just keep this guy at bay? Because as much as people will talk about, Ohio State still found their way through, and obviously they are more than Jeremiah Smith. Travion Henderson, Carnell Tate, Emeka Egbuka, all of those guys will make plays in this game. But the reality is, the entire offense for Ohio State that it looked like unstoppable for the first two games was held to 21 points. 7 of the 28 came off a scoop and score, so you're looking at this and you're saying 21 points from that offense, and 7 of those points came off a play that is very unlikely to happen in this game, and that screen pass that went for 75 yards. So you're looking at a lot of the different things that Yeah, so Anthony, you are right. There are some different concepts in there. So it's not necessarily to say that they're going to play a ton of just cover 0, cover 1, and just let these guys run free one-on-one with these guys. But they will lean on it a little bit more often than some other teams have. I do think they will have a little bit more zone concept in this game, but it's not something that they're very comfortable doing, at least in the sense of they're going to drop into a cover 3, just entirely everyone playing in zones. They're going to play a lot of maybe cover 2 man, a lot of different things where you have the safeties over top, but the guys up top are really just playing their man straight up. So that's going to be an interesting battle, and we'll see how much they employ that man coverage on the front end, zone coverage on the back end, and it'll be a chess battle. There's no doubt about that for this one. But Leonard Moore, Christian Gray, they're about as good as it gets when it comes to man coverage. I don't know if anyone can guard this kid, man coverage. So they're probably going to have to change it up just a little bit. It'll be very interesting to see how much they change it up. Or do they say, this is what got us here and we're going to let it take us to a national title? And Ohio State would be more than fine with that. They'll throw it up to this guy and see what happens. But it's going to be awesome to watch. And another reason why that Al Golden is just so important in this game, maybe the most important coach in this game. Talking about the coaches, the coaching staff, which one would you take is a big-time question that I have, because I think they're two of the best 3 coaching staffs in the country. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous what these guys have in both experience, but just in ability, in play calling, and all the different things. They've been absolutely incredible throughout this year and in their past. But for Ohio State, Ryan Day, Chip Kelly, Jim Knowles, downright incredible. All very experienced, smart guys that are some of the best schemers in the country. Really remarkable group, and obviously they've done an incredible job with this team. Are already uber talented, but the play calling has been downright elite, especially in the CFP. Then Notre Dame, Marcus Freeman, Mike Denbrock, and Al Golden are downright elite as well. I think those are the 2 best play callers you could have in the country on one team. I think it's going to be incredible to watch what these head coaches can do, and which one of these head coaches, which one of these staffs lean or get the win in this one. But I'm going to go Notre Dame. I'll be totally honest. I think those coordinating hires are such good guys. I think both of them I'd put in my top 3 in defensive and offensive coordinators right now. I'm going to lean towards Notre Dame. I think they're both elite, and I think Ohio State might have a little bit more of that experience factor, but at the end of the day, I think both these coaches are absolutely incredible. I think Notre Dame just might be that little bit more elite, especially in the play calling department. But going to be incredible to watch these 2 coaching staffs go at it. And yeah, another big time question is, can those linebackers help out in some way? And not even with Jeremiah Smith, Carnell Tate, and Igbuka, which they will have to do at some point, but also with G. Scott. If you handle G. Scott, if you keep him from making an effect, then you can focus on those guys a little bit more readily. Those linebackers are going to be a huge piece of that, just to take away that counterpunch that Ohio State has really shown. We talked about the coaching staffs. How about the quarterbacks? Which one do you trust more to make big-time plays in this game? And this is a very interesting question, because when I was talking about them yesterday, I said Ohio State had the advantage at quarterback. I still very much believe that they have the advantage at quarterback. I think Will Howard is the better quarterback in this battle. Doesn't necessarily mean that you would trust him more, because the reality is he has been a little bit more prone to make mistakes than Riley Leonard has throughout his career. Riley Leonard has a little bit more of that dual threat ability to get out of precarious situations and make some big time plays. There's an argument to be made for Riley Leonard. Now, I will go with Will Howard. I'll be totally honest with you. I am going to go with Will Howard, because I do think that Will Howard is just a little bit more able passing the ball downfield. I think he's playing with a ton of confidence. I think his legs will be a factor in this game in some way or another. I do think he's going to be someone to watch, and I just trust him that little bit more. I think both these guys are incredible, and I trust both these guys to win this football game. But at the end of the day, I will lean towards Will Howard. I will lean towards that guy that can throw the ball downfield just a little bit better. And Anthony, I would sign on for that 10 times out of 10. If you could give me overtime games in the semifinal and final every single year, sign me up. That would be downright incredible, and you could very well get in this one. This one could get slogged down, and then you're looking up, and it's 20-20 going into overtime. But the matchups of the game that I want to watch out for, we'll start with that Ohio State pass game against the Notre Dame secondary. We will get into this in more detail tomorrow, of course, but this is very obvious. Xavier Watts, Jalen Shuler, Christian Gray, Leonard Moore against Jeremiah Smith, Emeka Egbuka, Carnell Tate, Brendan Ennis, G. Scott. It is ridiculous, the talent that is going to be going at each other, and as we've talked about, it might just be one-on-one in a couple of these different scenarios. So it's going to be really, really interesting to watch all of this unfold, and it's going to be fascinating to see how they go about business in this game. And Anthony, you make a great point. How is Ohio State going to slow down that three-headed monster? Because it is a big-time task, and that's the other battle that I'm talking about here. The Notre Dame run game against the Ohio State front seven, it's going to be a nightmare to deal with. I'll be totally honest, Anthony. I don't think there's a good way to defend this team. I don't think there's a way to make sure that they don't make plays. What I will say is Penn State did a very good job of eliminating the two running backs, of keeping the traditional run game kind of under wraps. Now, Riley Leonard made plays with his legs, no doubt about that, but I do think if you can kind of plug that middle, make sure that traditional run game is stifled just a little bit, I think Riley Leonard, you're going to say he can make a fair share amount of plays. Also, it does help that you have a guy like Caleb Downs. It does help that you have a guy that the second that guy leaves the pocket, he is flying downhill with bad intentions, and I think he's going to be able to make a lot of plays in the quarterback run game. So I think it's kind of just personnel more than anything else, Anthony. I think there's different ways to scheme this up, and there's different ways to kind of get ready for it, but the reality is you just need to have the dudes. You just need to have the guys in the interior to push around the offensive line for Notre Dame and plug up that interior run, and then you need to have guys like Sonny Styles and Caleb Downs and Cody Simon that can really run down a running quarterback. I think they have both those things. So it's going to come down to execution more than anything else, and we'll see who can execute a little bit better. And then Chip Kelly against Al Golden. It's going to be incredible to watch this unfold because Al Golden, we talked about it, the man coverage is going to be a huge part of this. How does he kind of work with that? Does Chip Kelly just try to keep them off balance with a lot of different looks? Does it come down to that zone versus man coverage question, or can Al Golden confuse them in different ways? It's going to be fascinating to watch this one unfold, and I definitely do think that Al Golden's going to say, I trust our guys on the outside, but I do also think he's going to try to blitz a little bit more often, try to get to the quarterback a little bit more readily, because obviously you do want to make sure that those guys on the island don't have to guard for 10 seconds on any given play. Riley Leonard, can he be a difference maker with his legs? Because he better. That's the reality of this game. We just talked about it, Anthony, how it's going to be a nightmare to kind of figure out how they're going to defend it, and he's going to have to be the guy that's going to have to make big plays. He made big plays against Penn State, didn't necessarily get going super consistently throughout that game, but definitely made some big-time plays down the stretch. Obviously, against Georgia, made a number of plays, so I do think it's a world where if he doesn't make plays with his legs, if that running game is not able to predicate off Riley Leonard being able to pull that ball, get off on the edge, and make 8, 9, 10 yards on a first down, I think you're going to have a problem, just plain and simple. I think these running backs are fantastic, but if they don't have to worry about that quarterback read game, this interior is going to get absolutely abused. I'm just being totally honest. There is no way that you're going to be able to pull Riley Leonard's running ability out of this game and still have a Notre Dame win. So you're going to have to get this. If you're Notre Dame, you're going to have to get Riley Leonard out on the edge and avoid a guy like Caleb Downs flying downhill at what looks like 1,000,000 miles an hour every time he does it. But overall, it's going to be awesome to watch what he can do. I do think this has to be a difference maker. So can it be? Notre Dame fans better hope so, because if it's not, then I think you might have a problem on your hands. And then could the title mean a change at both places? And this is one we talked about a little bit earlier in the show, so I won't waste too much time on this, but there is the question here. We talked about it earlier, or I believe last week actually we talked about it, was Ryan Day. Does he just move on regardless? Does he just move on even if they win the national titles? Does he say that this is too much, I have no desire to be around the constant criticism and unfair criticism that I've got, I'm going to ride out as a national champion and move on to the NFL? Does Marcus Freeman do that? Because the reality is, I'm not necessarily saying that he is going to leave Notre Dame. I fully expect him to stay at Notre Dame for quite some time. That being said, if the Bears call and your guy, and it's Caleb Williams up there, it could be hard to turn down. I'll be totally honest. Now, I tend to believe he will, but I do think it's one of those big-time questions. Same for Ryan Day, that there are going to be moments where he is going to be able to walk out of this program, and it will be in this offseason that he will have a little bit of an opening. I think he'll be at Ohio State in 2025, but there are questions behind the scenes, and it's definitely something that you're going to watch. So overall, this is a major hypothetical. I think both these coaches will be with their teams in 2025, but I do think if one of those dominoes fall, which it's been talked around both these coaches that they possibly could fall, then you're having a lot of questions, and then you're going into the offseason and thinking, what do these teams look like? What does every team look like with Ohio State or Notre Dame trying to poach a couple of coaches? So a lot of things can happen over the next little bit. The coaching one was more just kind of a thought experiment than anything else. I don't expect that to happen by any respect, but it is going to be awesome to watch this unfold. Tomorrow, It's all national championship stuff. From start to finish, we're going to get into matchups, players to watch, some coaching matchups, different things. We'll get into why I think this might be the best shot Notre Dame and Ohio State has for a while. I'll get into my official pick, what it would mean for these teams to win a national title. Everything around the national title is happening tomorrow, so we'll talk about it in very much depth tomorrow, but that'll do it for this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a lot to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It does make a huge difference. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all the social pages for all the content and updates you could possibly need. We have great people doing great work across every single sport you could want, so anything in the world of sports, come on over to GSMC and we have you totally covered. But thank you once again for listening. We'll be back tomorrow for just a national championship extravaganza, but I'll see you then at 9 a.m. Eastern.
Mm-hmm.